The second lecture we're going to have in this course is going to be on race and racism. Now, I know that this is a very sensitive topic in the United States or all over the world, but I want you to understand that we're really looking at it in a very calm manner and from a very scholarly manner. The goal of the lecture is not to demonize anybody or to make somebody look like they are not fully human or something like that, okay? So bear that in mind. And the reason why I think a lecture on race and racism is very important is simply because the two textbooks that you're going to read in this course, the Ronald Takaki book, A Different Mirror, you're going to see where the question of race becomes very, very central in understanding immigration and the settlement of people in this country. And then in the history of social welfare in this country also, you're going to see how the debate about the kind of public policies we need to put in place or the kind of social policies in order to balance the gap between the well-to-do and the people who are left behind. And remember that this is a struggle in every human society. They struggle with it in ancient Greece. They struggle with it in Rome, in Britain, in France, in all parts of the world. The gap between the rich and the poor need to be kind of like closed. So in the debate about social and public policies in the United States, you cannot really understand that without understanding race. So the goal of this lecture is to just introduce you to some concepts about race, which can help you to engage the literature when you're reading it in the two books. So the first thing we're going to start with is to define what is race, okay? So race is a category of people who have been singled out as inferior or superior, often on the basis of physical characteristics such as skin color, hair texture, and eye shape. I hope everybody understands this. So generally when we classify people in terms of race today in the United States or in other parts, we are trying to classify people based on physical characteristics. How does the person's hair look like? What is their skin color? Sometimes people use nose also because, for instance, people in Africa do not have aquiline nose. Aquiline means straight nose. They have nose that are not, things like that. So physical appearance is what is used to classify people, okay? Now, the second point there, the second point I would like to make is that this definition of race is characterized by controversy. So what is the controversy? And I know for some people who have been raised to believe that race is just classifying people based on physical characteristics and that's it, it's just like something that is given, they would find this really very, very strange that there's controversy about this definition. And the controversy is that it is based on biological conception of race. So what does that mean? The assumption there is that if I see you, if I see your skin color, your hair texture, and your eye shape, I can use that to determine who you are inside. Okay? Let me repeat again. In other words, when I get out of this building and I see somebody who is white, okay, then I will just assume that, well, because I have seen these physical characteristics, that tells me who he or she inside her, okay? Or if I see a black person, or a Latinx person, or an Asian person, okay? Or a Native American, I can just say, because I have seen their physical characteristics, that tells me who they are inside. But do you agree with that? Do you believe that all white people or all people who are defined as Caucasian think the same way inside, or they are all the same people inside, just because they have the same physical characteristics? Or do you think that simply because people are black, that automatically tells you that there's a way that all think the same way inside, or because they are Asian, or because they are Latinx? You see the point? So that's why there's a controversy about this definition, because there's some biological assumptions that we are really making. So the caution here we're making is that this definition of race is not really like the real definition of race, simply because it is making an assumption that is problematic. You're classifying people based on their physical characteristics, but you're making an assumption that because you know them to have these physical characteristics, this will help you predict who they are inside. But I don't think this is necessarily the case. If this was the case, we wouldn't have had the Civil War in the United States. Because when you look at the Civil War, you're going to find out that it was fought by people who are white in the North and white who are in the South. But if you see some of the documentaries about the Civil War, for instance, in the United States, you'll be very amazed that why are these people white, but they disagree so much that they are killing each other like that. Over 600,000 people died during the Civil War, okay? So that shows you that even when you see somebody having some certain physical characteristics, you still have to ask yourself, how is the person made up inside, okay? It's very important. Now, the second idea I want to move on to is the idea of race as socially and politically constructed identity. So what does it mean to say that race is socially and politically constructed identity? Here, what we're saying is that race is socially constructed or socially defined because physical markers or characteristics in and of themselves do not constitute racism. In other words, many people in the United States may assume that simply because somebody is white, then there must be this or whatever or something like that. No. Race is only meaningful. These physical characteristics are only meaningful or only become something if we assign meaning to them. What do I mean by when we assign meaning to them? Assigning meaning means when somebody is white or they have blonde hair or something like that, then we assume that well, they must be this or that. I have a documentary theme on blonde hair, how the assumptions people really make or something like that. There's just assumptions people make about people who have blonde hair, that they are this, they are that, okay? So, but the point we're making here is that the physical characteristics themselves are nothing unless we assign meaning to them, okay? When you assign meaning to them, then that's when the physical characteristics become something really else, okay? And so racism is only when society through political power assigns or impose meaning to the physical markers of characteristics, treating some people as desirable while others are undesirable. So in other words, these physical characteristics are not really the problem, but when using political and social power, some people decide to say that if you have these physical characteristics, then you are up here. But if somebody else does not have these physical characteristics, then they are down at the bottom of the totem pole. Okay? That's where it becomes a problem. And for those of you who want to broaden this discussion, if you really understand the logic of what I'm explaining here, even though here we're talking about race, but you can see that happening with ethnicity also, because with ethnicity in other parts of the world too, you find some people based on their physical characteristics, because if you go to some countries in the world, just on the physical characteristics of the person, they can tell what the person's ethnicity are. But then those differences in and of themselves are nothing. But when a society using political power decide to say those people who have these characteristics are up here, but those people who do not have these characteristics are down, that's when you have, in the United States, we'll say racism, or in the Western world. Now, in Africa, it may not be racism, but essentially, what is happening with ethnicity is more or less the same as racism. So simply because somebody is in Africa, but they are treating somebody, they are classifying people based on physical characteristics using ethnicity, they are no less racist, if you like, than somebody who is racist in another part of the world. So I just want to broaden the discussion so that people would understand this. Okay. The other thing I want to emphasize is the million dialogue. So what is the million dialogue? I don't have the time to get into details here, but I will encourage you to go online and just type million dialogue, and then you're going to find out that it was a controversy that arose in ancient Athens, because ancient Athens was fighting war with Sparta, and the people of Melos supporting Sparta, and so Athens was very concerned that these people will just come and invade them because they are supporting Sparta. So they decided, the Athenian generals decided to go and tell the million generals that they should surrender. Okay? So they told them to surrender. And when they told them to surrender, the million people, to cut the long story short, refused to surrender. And when the million people or generals started putting forward rational arguments to make a case that we have not done anything for you, Athens, why would you come and tell us to surrender? The Athenian general said, true dialogue only takes place between people of equal power. If one person if one person has more power than the other, then the weaker person just will have to suck it up, because there cannot be true dialogue between people who have unequal amount of power. And I draw this because this is happening in the ancient times. But the lesson from there is that when there's inequality in power, I do not care whether it is in Africa, it is in Europe, it is in Jerusalem, or whether it is in Saudi Arabia or anywhere, wherever there's inequality in power, if you do not know how to manage that, it can lead you to use it to your own advantage, or if you're careful and ethical, you can use it for the benefit of everyone, okay? So from this perspective, when you check the history of European countries, you're going to find out that when there was inequality in power in Europe, if you study the history of Europe, many European groups oppress other European groups. We tend to forget about that because today we are just focusing on black and white. I'm not saying that it's not important to focus about white and other minorities in the United States or other parts of the world, but what I'm just trying to say is to broaden the discussion that if you have more power than somebody, even if you are in Africa, okay, and you are all black, yet those people who have more power than others can use that power to define those that are powerless in a certain way, okay? So just understand that. Power is central here. Even if there are physical characteristic differences, if nobody has power to assign meaning to those differences, it's not going to result in some kind of one group oppressing another. Okay, with that said, let's move to the third concept I want us to talk about. So what is racism? Okay, so racism is not an individual random act. And what do I mean by that? So if something happens somewhere, and let's say a white person did something to somebody, something like that, just a random act like that does not necessarily constitute racism, okay? For you to conclude that it is racism, you have to go beyond that and look at something, okay? And so racism is a systematic discrimination against or exclusion and oppression of a group of people based on accidental qualities such as skin color, hair texture, shape, and size of lips, physical characteristics, etc. Okay? So what racism here simply means is just that if somebody is treating another person, but the only reason they are doing that is simply because of the physical characteristics of that person, no other reason. They are just treating them that way because of their physical characteristics, then that is racism. But then racism is systematic, or it is systemic. What we mean by that is that it is not just a single individual making the act, but it is something that is kind of like something that has developed into a system where it's not just one single individual that is engaged in that act, but it is part of the way people really operate. And again, let me broaden this discussion because I don't want this discussion to be really very narrow or myopic. If you go to Africa, for instance, or you go to another part of the world, let's say Asia or something like that, is it possible that somebody will be treated differently just because of their physical characteristics related to their ethnicity? Okay? If that could happen, such people cannot claim themselves to be morally superior simply because it's not something between a white person and another racial group or something like that. The logic is the same. So there's no basis for anybody to claim superiority there, okay? So bear this in mind that it is systemic. It is systemic means it is not a random act. Check all the information when there's an accident, when there is some kind of crime or violence or something like that. The initial thing the police will try to investigate is that, is this act based on a plan, or is this something that happened by accident? Okay? Because if it is something that happened by accident, we'll say, well, we are sorry, but the person will still be punished, but this is not like something systemic or something systematic. But if this is something that was planned for certain reasons, then it's a different kind of crime. It's systematic in that respect. So that's what I want to really emphasize about this. There can always be conflict among people, whether it is in Africa, Brazil, India, China, or something like that. But when it is systematic, it's a different thing. Okay, racism is systemic. It is about having power and the capacity to translate prejudices, attitudes, and feeling of superiority into practice, custom, policy, or law. So what we're saying here by it being systematic is that, and this is a discussion that we're going to conclude with, the relationship between prejudice and discrimination. Somebody can have prejudice against you, okay? But if they don't have power over you, they cannot translate those prejudices into policy, okay? But if somebody has prejudices against you and they have power also over you, they can now sit down and say, I want to translate my prejudices into law so that it becomes part of the custom, the way of life in this society, okay? This is what we mean by it is systemic, Okay, so somebody can have prejudice, but if they don't have power over you, well, they can make you feel you're a nuisance or something like that, but they cannot do something that would directly kind of like harm you because they don't have the power to really translate that, okay? And then racism thwarts or frustrates another group and makes it impossible for that group to develop itself. The reason why we are concerned about racism is that when people are racist, they use racism to prevent other groups from realizing their full potential as human beings. And this is a problem. This is a problem. I can talk a little bit about this to you because I come from a poor family in Africa and I came to the United States. And some years ago, I got the Fulbright Fellowship and went back to Nigeria, my country of birth, for 1 year to teach. And I reflected on myself as a human being that given my background, my poor background from the northeastern part of Nigeria, and given how many people are suffering there, and I am a minority in terms of ethnicity, religion, and social class, I'm from a poor socioeconomic background, I was just kind of like nobody. I would have been nobody. But because I got the opportunity to come here, I've been able to develop myself. And so as a person, this has helped me to understand what it means to give everybody an opportunity to develop themselves. It's very, very important. And when I say this, I'm not saying this just like for minorities or whatever. We're talking about all human beings, okay? So we are concerned about racism here when racism prevents some people from discovering their potential. Because for you to even develop yourself, you first have to understand what are your potentials, okay? There are many people who could have been something else, but they never had the opportunity to discover their potential. So this is really, really very, very important. We will see that in the United States, one of the struggles we have here is just that when we begin to talk about this, sometimes it's just, we look at it just racially. What I mean by racially is that, okay, minorities because of race, they need this, they need this, they need that. Okay, that's fine. But when you look at it because of the way America has transformed, there are many white people who are struggling, who need assistance, but they don't feel represented in the discussion because the discussion is framed in terms of skin color only, okay? If you watch some documentary films about Appalachia, you're going to see that there are many white people who are suffering there. But if the discussion is just framed between whites and other minorities, they just feel like, okay, where do I belong, okay? Okay, good about, I hope this is very, very clear. The key issue here is how racism prevents people from pursuing their aspirations or understanding what their potentials are and then realizing them. Okay, the fourth thing we're going to move on to is types of racism. Types of racism. This discussion here is very, very important because given all the discussion going on in the United States sometimes, I feel that there's a way in which it can be superficial. When discussion is superficial, sometimes we tend to ignore the complexity. I'm not saying this out of any kind of arrogance. I'm saying this with all sense of humility, having sat down and read this thing really very, very carefully. And I hope by the time we finish this discussion, you're going to find out that there are many nuances when we talk about racism. So first, racism as worldview. What is racism as worldview? There are three issues I want to talk about here. First, genes as determinant of inherent worth. If somebody is racist, the key issue we're making here is that from the perspective of racism, a person's inherent worth is judged based on his or her genes. To find out who people are and what is the quality of their lives, we must inquire into their ancestry or their genetic structure. In other words, from this perspective, or from the perspective of racism as a worldview, if you want to know why somebody has achieved something or why somebody has not achieved something, you look at their genetic structure or their genetic makeup. That's the way racism is. In other words, there's an attempt to reduce everything about gene. Remember when we defined race at the beginning, we said you're looking at these physical characteristics and you're trying to tie it to something inside the person, okay? So this is one of the elements of racism as a worldview. Many people do not know this. But it means you try to understand people, their achievements or something like that. You explain it by looking at their genetic structure. You don't think there is any other factor that can affect someone's achievement except their race. Second, race as a source of meaning and personal value. When somebody is racist, okay, or racism is their worldview, when they wake up in the morning, what gives them a lot of meaning is that I am a person of this race, and that's what gives me meaning, personal meaning in life. Okay? Now, there are some people who argue, for instance, if you really look at this, I don't want to digress into that, but I will just highlight it so that those of you who are interested in pursuing the line of analysis can do that on your own. But for instance, let me just use an example very quickly, like Christian. People who believe in Christianity, for instance, will say that their lives are rooted in their faith or something like that. But if the person is also racist, but with racism or with racism as a worldview, the personal value of the individual is rooted in their racial identity, you can see that there's a tension between what it really means to be a Christian, for instance, and what it really means to be a racist. Because a true Christian cannot wake up and just feel good about their personal identity just because of their race or something like that. Okay? But this is true also of Islam, and this is true also of Judaism. Because I'm saying these three because they are all Abrahamic religion and they come more or less from the same tradition. Okay? So the racist relies on race as a source of his or her personal value. Life has meaning and worth because it is part of the racial context. Selective genetic breeding is the only way to improve humanity. So if somebody is a racist and they truly believe that someone's achievement is determined by their racial genetic makeup, it means if you really want to have a better future, we need to promote eugenics. When you promote eugenics, which means only people who are of a certain race, and even within that race, people who have high ability are the only people who will reproduce, then that would mean in the future we're going to get people who are very brilliant and things like that. Okay? So strictly speaking, if someone's identity is based on this race or racism as a worldview, it can lead them to just begin to feel like the only way we can improve this world is through genetics or eugenics. Okay, and then the third element of the worldview of racism is deformity of the inner race or of the inferior race is essentialized. So what does that mean? When we say it is essentialized, we mean if somebody is considered to be an inferior race, like the way slaves were treated in this country or the way Native Americans were treated in the United States or whatever, there is an assumption that the reason why they are who they are is because there's something genetically in them that makes them inferior. They can never be civilized, or even if they would be civilized, there's a limit to how far you can civilize them. Okay? And because of that, that limits the amount of even investment some people would make in them. Okay? Because there's an assumption that they're just going to die. Okay? Because they have very limited capability to develop. So racism assumes some segments of humanity are defective in their essential being and therefore cannot be regenerated. So there's no need for you to invest in minorities or certain people that are considered to be racially inferior, because even if you invest in them, they are not going to develop, because the assumption based on this idea of racism as worldview is that the deficiency is essentially rooted in their biology. And because it is rooted in their biology and you cannot change their biology, there's very little you can do by investing money, by investing in them or something like that. Now, to give you an idea of how this thing has been challenged, there was a time when in the United States people were thinking this way, and then black people are inherently lacking intelligence and things like that. And then when things change in the northern part of the United States, while there was still racial oppression in the southern part of the United States, many black people moved from the south to the north. And when they moved to the north, places like Detroit and other places like that, the northeastern part of the United States, many of them had the opportunity to develop themselves because they did not have those opportunities in the southern part of the United States. And then later on, when they were given this IQ test, some of these black people that moved to the north performed better than some of the whites in the south. And that challenged this idea of inherent or essentialized nature of inferiority of black people just because of their biology or their genetic makeup. Okay? So these things have been challenged. But I'm just trying to draw you an attention, because sometimes we talk about this just in general. But racism, but let me quickly also broaden this discussion. If you go back to Africa, you are going to find out that there are certain ethnic groups that also essentialize the nature of the members of another ethnic group. Okay? In other words, just because the person comes from another ethnic group, they would think of themselves as either intellectually superior or the members of the other ethnic group as intellectually inferior. So my point here is that if you understand the logic of what we're dealing with, even though on the surface you think like there are differences in skin color, but it is essentially the same logic. I have power, I define some people as inferior, some people as superior, and this inferiority or superiority is based on genetic makeup. Okay? So you can see that I'm a black person, but when I talk about racism, I don't see myself in any way exonerated. I have to interrogate myself because I understand that the logic here, of course, it is kind of white versus this and that. But actually, when you understand the logic, it is not just about that. It is something much deeper.